All right. So I ended the last lecture with this slide, um, talking about Japan observes Western colonialism and imperialism in its neighborhood. So I want you to really kind of like visualize and think about the way that Japanese nationalists would be thinking about things. So here's China, okay, and um, we see Japan, okay, in this neighborhood, and they see China get tore down, and so the British have control of Hong Kong. Um, they watch the French um, take over Vietnam, Indochina, as it's called at the time. They see the British over here, okay, in what is now Indonesia, and the Philippines, the U.S., the Spain, and the U.S., and the Dutch here in Indonesia. So they're just watching Europeans take over all over it in their hemisphere. And the US also doing the same. Okay, so they're just watching this and they're saying, this is the way the West does things. And to be like a Westerner, you have to be a colonizer. And we need to play that role. So before Japan was somewhat, I don't want to say subservient, but they kind of recognized China as the bigger nation. Well, they clearly don't take China as serious anymore. And something not kind of talked about in this book, but there were Western race theorists who also believed that they had like a racial hierarchy and interpreted the Japanese as being a more superior race compared to, let's say, Chinese or Filipinos and so forth. And some of them kind of took that to heart, if you will, and bought into this idea of a kind of racially superior Japan also. All right. So Japanese imperialism. Japan feels it must also become an imperial power to survive. So initially, they were trying to isolate themselves. Now they realize that to survive, you have to dominate others, just like the West was doing, just like the US was doing. Everybody was doing it. Dominate weaker nations. They take over some islands. The largest was Okinawa, and they annexed it in 1879. They coveted Korea's natural resources. And here's something very important to keep in mind. We still see a lot of bad blood between Koreans and Japanese left over from World War II. Well, where did this all start? It all started back here, okay, further back. So, the Meiji regime, remember the regime that then put the emperor into power, forced Korea to trade in 1875. So Korea ends up now facing dominance from Japan. Here's a little cartoon showing that. Now there's a building of tensions. In 1880s, China tries to forestall Japanese expansion by encouraging Korea to open to the West. China sends in troops. Japan then sends in their troops. Chinese and Japanese agree to withdraw. And then we have a Tomahawk movement that is similar to the Taiping Rebellion. But ultimately, it also fails. Japan and China both send in troops under the pretext of crushing this kind of populist revolt, and then conflict with each other. Here's something to keep in mind about Korean history. Koreans have... I would like to talk more about Korea, and unfortunately, I'm not able to have the time, and I might lose you if I kind of try to incorporate too many different histories. But let's just point out that Korea was wedged in between these superpowers and often kind of uses a springboard for the interest of one nation over the other. Okay, and it might help explain a little bit about North Korea and the kind of isolationism and the kind of hostility that you see come out of the North. It's not just due to some sort of communist ideology or the ideology of just like a crazed leader, but it comes out of this history as well. Okay, and the historian Bruce Cummings kind of tries to make that case. So, all right. So the Sino-Japanese War. The Chinese military was ill-equipped, ill-prepared, and inadequate. So there was a war between China and Japan. China was defeated at sea. Japan overran Korea and a southern part of China. In the deal, Japan gets island of Taiwan and parts of China, but Russia, France, and Germany would force a withdrawal. And this is something to keep in mind as well, is that Japan's going to keep getting frustrated. They keep emulating the West, and then Western powers will always kind of say, well, you're not really equal to us, and you can't do certain things that we're allowing ourselves to do. So that's going to end up really continually being a frustration and an issue for the Japanese nationalists. Okay. And then this also ended China as a protectorate of Korea and pretty much makes Korea vulnerable to Japan. And then we have the Russo-Japanese War. Here's what's really significant about this short war. Imperial Japan forced Russia to abandon its expansionist policy in the Far East. And Japan becomes the first Asian power in modern times to defeat a European power. This was an inspiration to many, many sectors of the world, and this kind of makes Japan seen by many Asian nationalists, meaning other Asian countries, as like heroes, inspiring. Like, hey, the Japanese can kick out European powers and set them back. Then, look, it can be done. So Japan ends up becoming popular right here initially, but remember, they're not trying to liberate Asia. They're trying to put Japan on the same par of other imperial powers. Okay, and that's something to think about. So I'm going to end that there, and we'll get to the next lecture.